Brad Pitt was one of those people who had grown accustomed to the unexpected twists of fate. His life was an endless journey from one project to another, from one city to the next. He had often encountered unusual offers that would seem like pranks to most people. And so, on one such day, as Brad was going through the letters in his mailbox, he noticed a strange invitation. A black envelope with golden letters: "You are invited to participate in an exclusive game." The address and seal meant nothing, except hinting that this offer came from a world beyond ordinary entertainment. He put the letter aside, not giving it much thought, assuming it was just another advertising trick or an attempt to lure him into filming a new project. However, curiosity got the better of him. He opened the letter and read the short message. "You are about to experience something you could never have dreamed of. The rules are simple. Play or leave. No consequences. See you soon." This wasn't just an invitation, it was a challenge. He smiled. Someone clearly decided to play a game with him, and Brad was ready for it. He thought it might be part of a new show or even a trap for a movie. But it was the anticipation of the unknown, a slight feeling of uncertainty, that led him to make his decision. The next day, he was brought to a remote part of the city, where an old warehouse, disguised as a regular building, became his first step into this strange adventure. He still thought it was a shoot, that professional directors and actors were hiding behind cameras at the other end. But when the doors of the warehouse closed behind him, and he found himself inside, there were no cameras, no sound, just people like him. No rules? Brad thought, looking around at the strange participants who had been brought here. They looked like ordinary people, of different ages, genders, and social status. Some glanced at others slyly, some seemed clearly anxious, and others appeared somewhat more relaxed. But they all knew, they weren't here by accident. Suddenly, a loud signal sounded. A red text appeared on the screen in front of everyone: "Attention, the game starts now." All the participants froze, waiting for instructions. Brad felt the tension hanging in the air. This wasn't filming. This was something else. The process began with them being offered to take part in the first challenge. The screen displayed a simple task: the players had to walk through a long room filled with strange mannequins and automated systems that blocked their path. The task was simple: reach the end of the room and avoid the traps. But with every step, Brad felt more and more that this was not just a game. Everyone around started to move cautiously, at first not knowing what to do. Brad was one of the last to take the first step. He observed the moving mannequins and began to look for patterns in their movements. A person beside him stopped, unsure how to act. Brad took a few steps forward, carefully considering each move, not rushing. But something was wrong. He felt the tension, and every step was accompanied by a quick glance at the mannequins, which now seemed more alive than usual. The feeling that this game wasn't just about winning, but about survival, began to seep into his consciousness. As soon as Brad reached the door on the other side of the room, the system made a loud noise and flashed a red signal: "You lost." That moment became an eye-opener for him. He hadn't won. This wasn't a show. This was a game, and the stakes were real. Leaving the room, Brad encountered other players, some of whom had already begun showing signs of panic, while others remained resolute. He heard someone shouting about their right to fairness. But Brad knew, he had to keep his head cool. Nothing was random. He sensed something was off, and now he needed to figure out exactly what. He was on the verge of realizing that this wasn't just a test. This was a real game, and the stakes weren't just about his life. Resignation was not an option. Brad decided, if this was a game, then he would fight. But how and when, he didn't know yet. After the first challenge, Brad Pitt couldn't shake off the feeling of confusion. He stood in the hallway, among the other players, trying to process what had just happened. The mannequins, the systems that seemed like part of the show, actually appeared to be something much more sinister. With every step, he realized that the stakes were real, this game wasn't just for entertainment. However, there was no time for reflection. The system alerted everyone, the next challenge will begin in 10 minutes. In panic, the players started moving to the next room, and Brad stayed behind, gathering his thoughts. His intuition told him that the key to surviving here wasn't physical strength, but the ability to plan every move ahead. "Hey, you're not just going to give up, are you?" He heard a familiar voice and turned around. A middle-aged man in expensive clothing stood next to him. He looked like some sort of businessman. Brad nodded, deciding not to ignore the conversation. "No. It's strange, but I'm not going to play along with this show," he replied, hiding his true thoughts. "Did you notice how they lured us here?" The man frowned. "It all looks like some kind of game," he said bitterly. "But the stakes are clearly much higher than they seem. I think they're trying to scare us so those who give up won't be a problem." Brad didn't respond, but his mind was already at work. He knew that most of the participants would probably become prey for the organizers. They were panicking, not knowing what to do, and every step could be fatal. His mind raced with questions: who was behind all this? And most importantly, how could he use this to his advantage? When the time ran out, the screen flashed red again. "The next challenge begins now." This time, instead of just mannequins, the screen displayed information. The players would have to walk through a long corridor, where automated devices and suddenly opening traps blocked their way. Those who fell into the traps wouldn't be able to continue the game. Brad looked at those around him. He saw how some began to panic. The same man he had spoken to was already ready to act decisively, but Brad saw how his movements were unnaturally fast. He rushed without thinking, and that would likely lead him to failure. "Wait," Brad said, holding him by the arm, "don't rush. This isn't the time for panic. Give me a few seconds to figure out the path." The man nodded and stepped aside, feeling frustrated but understanding that Brad clearly had a plan. Brad paused and looked around. The corridor was dimly lit, and on the walls, he could spot old marks, scratches, and torn fabric, indicating that this wasn't the first time someone had tried to make it through this path. Brad noticed small details: cracks in the walls that might hide dangerous mechanisms, and a small lever that could change the route. Trust no one, Brad thought. He knew he couldn't rely on others. He had to act alone. When the signal sounded and everyone started moving, Brad slowed his steps, carefully studying every detail along the way. He noticed how he could bypass one of the traps by using the same mannequins as in the previous challenge. For a moment, his eyes met a person at the end of the corridor. Brad saw how that person suddenly accelerated, thinking there was no danger in the way. And in that moment, the trap was triggered. The mechanism shot out a jet of gas, and the person was instantly trapped, unable to react. "Please follow me," a familiar voice came through the speakers. It wasn't just a warning, it was an order. Brad slowed his steps, realizing that each move was a risk. He bypassed several traps and eventually reached a door leading to the next area. He had the feeling that the Mafia, hiding behind the game, was setting up the players, pushing them towards certain defeat. At that moment, Brad understood what needed to be done. He turned to the men standing nearby and quietly said, "We need to be ready for them to deceive us at every turn. I'll check one detail in the system, and you try to get out, if you can. Trust no one." The man looked at him in surprise, but Brad was already ready to make his move. And now he had to decide, should he trust this companion, or use him as a pawn in his own game? When the doors closed, Brad realized that now he had a chance. He wouldn't just chase an illusory victory. He would play their game, but by his own rules. In the next challenge, Brad found himself in an even more confined room. The walls were covered in dark material, and the ceiling lights barely illuminated the path. It seemed they had entered some kind of enormous archway, and the room was beginning to resemble a labyrinth where it would be easy to get lost. Before we begin, I want to remind you of the rules, a voice came through the speakers. No alliances, no teams. Just you and your abilities. Those who do not overcome the challenge will not return. Many of the participants exchanged glances, their faces showing all the signs of panic. Brad knew that some of them might already be considering giving up, as fear and uncertainty began to take over. This often happened in such games. He noticed several people stepping back, seemingly trying to find an exit. But Brad was sure, if they even tried to escape, defeat would be inevitable. He glanced at his hand and saw faint traces left from the gas in the previous challenge. Every step now was a challenge for him, and he knew he had to keep his emotions under control. A new task appeared before him. They had to cross a long rope ladder, secured high above a dark chasm. But the ladder wasn't as simple as it seemed. Below was not just empty space, there was a hidden system that could activate at any moment. But Brad didn't rush. He carefully examined the ladder and noticed that one of the ropes was slightly loosened. Small details that might seem insignificant to an ordinary person were crucial in his eyes. He gently touched the rope and realized that if it gave way, it could cause the entire structure to collapse. He calmly stepped aside, letting the other participants try to go first. The players began moving one by one, but each of them, either too hasty or inexperienced, stepped on the weak spot of the ladder, causing the structure to sway. Brad remained alert. He had already noticed several times how the panic of the other players was gradually turning into chaos. His intuition told him that this was the real beginning of the game. It didn't matter who you were or what you could do, what mattered was who could withstand the pressure. When the last players attempted to cross the ladder, several of them immediately fell to the bottom, but fortunately, they landed on soft cushions hidden beneath a net. So, they're not killing us immediately, Brad thought, but he understood that this was all just part of the plan. His eyes never left what was happening around him. He realized that this game had nothing to do with simple challenges, it was a psychological maze. Every step could be decisive, every glance, a manipulation. And then, when his turn came, Brad approached the ladder with confidence. He knew what to do. Carefully checking each rope, he not only chose the strongest one but also found a small lever at the very end of the ladder that stabilized it. It was a clever but effective solution. When he crossed the chasm, Brad looked back. Some people were still frozen, unwilling to proceed. Almost all the participants around him began to lose hope. Brad was not one of them. He already knew that he had to keep his head cool, and his strategy was to observe, act cautiously, and trust no one. However, now the game was taking a completely different turn. When everyone had completed the last challenge, the voice in the speakers sounded again. Congratulations, you have passed the first stage. But remember, this is just the beginning. For those who do not handle what comes next, there is no way out. Hidden doors began to open behind him, and Brad found himself in the next sector, where the space was much smaller and darker. Now, he felt a sense of uncertainty looming over him. He could hear the growing nervousness of the other players behind him. One by one, they found themselves in new traps, and Brad began to wonder, how far were they willing to go? As strange as it was, now all of Brad Pitt's attention was not only focused on his own actions but also on the other participants. He began to calmly but carefully analyze their behavior, looking for those who could be useful later. But trust was not something he could afford. He stayed one step ahead, constantly thinking, now I know how they work. I'm playing by my own rules. The new room was gloomy, dark, and expressionless, just like all the previous ones, but now Brad began to feel how each new situation sharpened his perception. The air was thick with tension. He didn't know how much time had passed since he entered this nightmare, but one thing was certain, he had to become a master of this game. The Mafia, as he suspected, had played their card by luring him here, but Brad was not someone who falls into traps. He always knew he had to look for loopholes. From time to time, he glanced at the other participants. Many of them were clearly frightened, and their anxiety was becoming apparent. But Brad didn't rush to make deals or look for allies. He was on high alert, watching every move, every word. Even the slightest change in behavior could be a clue. Suddenly, a voice boomed through the speakers. "Attention! We have a new test for you. To complete it, you will have to pass through 3 levels, each level will involve puzzles and physical challenges. The first one to complete all 3 levels will not only be allowed to continue in the game but also get the chance to choose one player to take with them. You cannot remain in place. Time is limited." It seemed like Brad understood what was going on. The Mafia wasn't going to leave him alone that easily. At some point, they might suspect that he knew more than he appeared. So, he had to act as unnoticed as possible. He looked around at his competitors. In this challenge, there was no room for blind luck, and Brad knew that his main advantage was the ability to think ahead. As soon as the game started, Brad realized that the puzzles he was going to solve were only part of the equation. The first few steps led him to a system of mechanisms and levers. The room began to transform, the walls moving to create new obstacles. However, by watching the other players, he noticed something interesting. One of them was clearly preparing a hidden strategy, moving slowly and cautiously as if they knew what to expect. It was the businessman Brad had encountered in the previous challenge. Brad felt that he was not the only one who understood the seriousness of what was happening. Suddenly, he saw one of the players jerk, but they misjudged the angle and almost triggered a mechanical trap. It was quite dangerous, but Brad couldn't afford to get distracted. He already knew this person was not an ally. They were too impulsive and risky. Brad, on the other hand, was careful. The solution came when Brad realized that he needed to act proactively. He noticed a hidden door in the wall and remembered where the mechanism to activate the next stage of the game was located. The other players were busy solving puzzles, but Brad didn't waste time on them. He chose the path that allowed him to ignore all the unnecessary obstacles. Understanding that dangers could be lurking around every corner, he moved with calm precision, listening for every sound. When he reached the final mechanism that led to the room's exit, Brad noticed that a small change in the lever's position could affect the system. He understood immediately: if the lever didn't turn to the correct position, the door wouldn't open, and all his efforts would be in vain. Brad moved the lever in the right direction, and, as expected, the door opened. When Brad exited the room, he noticed that only 2 people were following him: the businessman he had encountered earlier and another participant, more secretive, wearing dark glasses, whom Brad had already suspected of having some strange connection to the game. He couldn't say for sure whether this person was on the Mafia side, but the feeling of unease didn't leave him. "You did that quickly," the businessman said, addressing Brad. "You know this isn't just a game, right?" "I think I know more than you," Brad replied, giving no room for further conversation. He knew he had to lead them away from himself, not establish relationships. The less they knew about his intentions, the safer it was for him. But at the next moment, Brad felt something strange. He noticed the gaze of the person in the dark glasses, who had lingered slightly behind. It was a gaze full of realization. He understood that someone was already watching him from behind, and it made him wary. Brad knew that he had become part of the game, not just according to the Mafia's rules, but by his own as well. He was ready to make all his moves, not simply by their plan, but in his favor. Nothing could be predicted with certainty, but one thing Brad knew for sure: if he didn't act quickly, all his efforts would be in vain. And so, before moving further, he had to figure out who among these people would become his ally and who would be a setup. When they approached the next door, Brad was left alone with the question of what his next move would be. He looked at the rest of the group and wondered: the Mafia understands that I'm playing with them. Now they need to do something to corner me. Time passed, and Brad sank deeper into this world, where every action of his could be decisive. After the last challenge, he didn't feel relief. On the contrary, it seemed that the tension was growing with every step. More and more players were starting to lose their vigilance, but Brad knew that to leave here alive, he had to stay one step ahead. As they passed through a few more rooms, their group, consisting of several people, found themselves in an even darker hallway. This place was filled with sounds that seemed to whisper in your ear. Soon, Brad realized that nothing was happening here by chance. Suddenly, a new voice appeared over the speakers. The time has come. This stage of the game will determine who moves forward. It will test not only your physical but also your moral qualities. There are no rules in this room. All participants will have to decide each other's fate. Who will be the victim, who will be the winner, is up to you. The words spoken by the voice echoed in Brad's mind. At first, he felt his tense muscles relax, as if he understood that the game wasn't just about the other players, but also about the game itself. Brad stood up and looked around the room. It was round, with several doors along the sides. In the center stood a table covered with many objects, along with a few chairs. On the table were cards that looked like playing cards and metal coins sparkling in the dim light. At first glance, it looked like a game of chance, but Brad understood, there was something more behind all of this. He walked over to the table, carefully inspecting all the items, trying to figure out how this could be connected to the mafia. Meanwhile, his companions started gathering around the table, nervously talking to each other. They didn't know exactly what they had to do, but the tension in the room became unbearable. When everyone sat down, the voice spoke again. So, in this game, each of you will choose one of the cards, not knowing what is written on it. Those who choose the wrong card will become the victims of the game. Those who choose the right one will continue on their path. But remember, in this game, your choices affect not only you but also those sitting with you at the table. Brad immediately realized, this stage was a psychological trap. Everyone around him was nervous, trying to win by luck, but Brad knew that wasn't how you win. He had to use his wits, not just rely on chance. He slowly reached for the cards. He knew that behind this simple choice, there was something bigger. His eyes scanned the faces of the other players. Each of them was desperately trying to maintain their composure, but Brad could see how scared they were. One of the participants, the businessman who had clearly tried to engage him in conversation, was also among them. He was noticeably nervous, his hand shaking slightly as he reached for a card. Brad waited for the right moment and chose the card he thought was the safest. He didn't rush to reveal it, knowing that if he opened his card first, others might use his information. At that moment, Brad saw one of the players, the man in dark sunglasses, choose a card with visible anxiety on his face. Brad knew that this man might be part of the conspiracy behind this game. He remembered how this participant had looked at him in previous moments, with some special knowledge that Brad couldn't immediately decipher. That look, full of suspicion and even threat, couldn't have been accidental. Then Brad realized that this man wasn't playing by the rules, and he might be connected to the mafia. He couldn't allow him to become a threat. Once everyone revealed their cards, Brad felt his heart skip a beat. It looked like a simple game of luck, but it turned out that each card had a hidden meaning they didn't know about. Brad was among those who had chosen the right card. Meanwhile, his neighbor, the man in dark sunglasses, got a card with a red mark, meaning his exclusion from the game. The voice over the speakers once again reminded everyone of the rules. Congratulations, those who chose the correct cards can continue. But be careful, behind every choice lies hidden meaning. Those who failed this stage are no longer part of the game. Brad knew that at that moment, they had all become part of something far more dangerous. This step was yet another test, but Brad realized his journey was just beginning. He stood up and looked around. The mafia was already trying to manipulate his moves. At that moment, it became clear to him, he couldn't afford to relax. Now he was ready for the next stage, the next game of the mind. As the remaining players stayed in the room, Brad felt his sense of control grow stronger. He noticed how the other players began to look at him differently. They no longer saw him just as an ordinary person. In their eyes, there was a mixture of fear and respect. Brad knew that now they saw him as a danger. And that was exactly what he needed. Now he could play by his own rules. With each new challenge, Brad felt his confidence growing. He was no longer just a player following a predictable path. He had become a true master of the game. His mind worked faster than ever, and each step was carefully thought out. He knew the Mafia was behind everything, and they were starting to realize that he was different from the other participants. Brad was playing against them, not with them. Each day, he gathered more evidence that the game was merely a cover for their darker dealings. As they reached the final stage, the voice boomed once again, but this time the tone was entirely different. Welcome to the finale. Here, everything will be decided. Only one of you will leave here alive. The rest will stay. Remember, this is not just a game. This is your life. At that moment, Brad noticed how his last remaining allies, the ones he had worked with through the various stages of the game, began to get nervous. But he remained calm. He knew that all these people would soon become his pawns in a game with much higher stakes. The Mafia was close to falling into their trap, and Brad was ready for the final move. The room they entered was gigantic and intimidating. In the center stood a long table, covered with numerous cards and coins. But this time, Brad noticed something strange. In the center of the table lay a single card that clearly held special significance. It was different from all the others. It gleamed as though it held something extraordinary. The voice thundered once more. Whoever takes this card will leave the game. But remember, it's not just your life at stake. This will be your final choice. Will you take the risk, or will you fade into the shadows like everyone else? Brad held his breath. He knew that for the Mafia, this was their chance to win, but he had already prepared his move. He slowly walked to the table, ignoring the gazes of the other participants. He knew that by taking this card, he would not only win but also turn their plans upside down. He grabbed the card without hesitation. In that instant, all the doors in the room slammed shut with a loud bang, and the lights went out. Silence surrounded them. Brad stood with the card in his hand, ready for the next step. And then something strange happened. On the screen in the corner of the room, the words, "You have won," appeared. All the other participants stood in shock, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Brad looked at them and felt their gazes fill with anxiety. He realized they now understood, he was smarter. He had figured out their game. The voice came through again, but this time it was filled with disappointment. You've won, Brad Pitt, but the Mafia realizes you've deceived them. However, unfortunately, we can no longer reverse the game. We must acknowledge defeat. Brad felt a surge of victory rise inside him. He had unraveled their system, used their mistakes, and manipulated them at every turn. And now, when they realized he had outsmarted them, it was already too late. The Mafia had lost. As Brad left the room, his entire life, his entire struggle, seemed to melt into that moment. He knew he had not only beaten their game, but he had also defeated their system. Leaving the place, Brad looked around and realized, he was not just the winner of this game. He was the winner in the fight against the system itself, against those who thought they controlled his life. He had proven that even in the darkest, most dangerous circumstances, one could emerge victorious by playing by their own rules. He exhaled and finally stepped outside. The light breeze filled his lungs, and he realized, none of this had been by chance. This was his path. And he had walked it. As he headed toward the exit, Brad heard the final words that came through the speakers. Your victories will not go unnoticed. We will be watching you. But Brad just smiled and stepped into the night, where freedom awaited him.